Hi, I'm Allie Hamilton, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the Come As You Are podcast. Every week, we'll be talking about some aspect of healing, usually around childhood wounds and complicated familial relationships. The topics will always coincide with my personal essay of the week, and this will be a place where we can take a deep dive together. I'm so thrilled you've joined me and delighted for you to always come as you are. Hi there. Hi there. Welcome to our talk. This week, the topic is I'll be waving forever, losing people or people we don't know how to lose. People we don't know how to lose is the subtitle. And I was writing about my Aunt Louise, who passed away unexpectedly on Tuesday. Today's Friday, in the very early morning hours. And I think I'm going to be able to talk about this. But my Aunt Louise was like a surrogate mom to me. That's not overstating the case. I have written a lot and talked a lot about my early childhood experiences because I think those are so important for all of us. They're just such formative years and really shape the way we think about ourselves, the world, love, whether we're safe, our impact on the people around us, all those things that are, a lot of different schools of psychology agree that our personalities are pretty well shaped by the time we're 5. There's, a little bit of difference of opinion on that, but for the most part. So, and I tend to think that that's the truth, and that whole idea of like, everything you need to know by the time you're out of kindergarten. I think that's also pretty real. And so my early childhood experiences were very positive, very loving. My mother's side of the family are New Jersey Italian, loving, affectionate, warm people. It's very interesting. And one of the things that I've been writing about in the memoirs, my mother kind of came out of that situation. She spent her childhood looking across the Hudson and feeling like the goal was to get to New York City. And that was the glamorous life. And my mother was not a warm, effusive, affectionate person with me. She was more that way with other people, but she was not really, she just wasn't the kind of person to wrap her arms around you or say, I love you, or she wasn't one to heap on like the verbal praise, or she just wasn't one of those demonstrative people when it came to affection or, yeah. So it's interesting because her mother was her best friend. Her dad died very suddenly when she was 13. And she grew up with her mother, and her mother could not have been more that way. And so when I was born, my mother was 24, she's very young. My dad was 20 years older than my mother. That's a whole other story. But, and so her mother was around a lot. My nanny, that's what I called her. And she was with us every day. We were either in Jersey City or my nanny would come into Manhattan and be with us at the apartment. She also had a house down at the Jersey Shore, and that is where we would spend the summers with my Aunt Louise and my Uncle Richie and my 4 cousins. And so my 4 cousins are all like 6, 8, 10, 12 years older than I am. And so I was like the baby of the family. And I grew up with them. They're more like siblings than cousins, really. And what ended up happening is my parents split when I was 4. The week before I turned 4, my grandmother died. My nanny died. And she had had breast cancer the last year of her life, but they didn't know that. They thought she had a cold that she couldn't shake. she just wasn't getting better. My mother was worried about her, of course. And then eventually it turned out she had cancer by the time they realized it had gone everywhere. So, and she was 58. She was very young. It kind of shattered my family of origin. My grandmother, I am going to get emotional. My grandmother was just like the most loving person. I still remember, I think of her every day, which is kind of amazing because it's, 50 years later, I still think of her every day. She just was like my safe place. And I think she was really trying to help my mother learn how to mother. And I think by the time I came along, my mother had so much trauma in her own life. It was not going to be easy for her, aside from the fact that she was really young. My mom found out that my dad had been having an affair that started when she was 7 months pregnant. She found out when I was 3 months old. I think it really kind of broke her in a way. Of course, their relationship started as an affair. So it's one of those like, if they'll do it with you, they'll do it to you situations. He left his family. He had a wife and a 14-year-old son, 16-year-old daughter. And he left them to be with my mother. I mean, so this is not, it's not the prettiest story. Anyway, my grandmother died, and my mother, I think, was really ashamed about a lot of things. I think that she felt like many people in her family had said, don't pursue this relationship. And when it fell apart, I think that she had some shame around that. My mother was not a person to ask for help. She really did not like to be wrong. And so when that first happened and my grandmother died, my mom took me to this friend of hers who had a farm. And I've written about this a lot too. Had not met this woman before. The woman had a daughter a little bit older than I was. And she left me at the farm. I think she just needed to recover. My grandmother had died. My dad left the next week. And I think my mother was not okay, which is understandable. She's 28. She's got, suddenly a single mom and all of that. My dad had continued to cheat on her after the initial affair. So I'm on this farm. I don't know these people. I don't know like where I am or, how to reach anyone. And I'm 4. So basically that was one of those explosive moments in my own life and, created as you don't need to be like Freud to figure out you're probably going to have some abandonment stuff. So that's been some of my life work and healing work. Anyway, eventually my mother came and got me and life began. I think it took about 6 months for my dad to find a place. By the time he did, he was living with the woman who became my stepmother eventually. And there were a whole bunch of women that he was seeing on the side. My dad would have been on the kiss cam there. I was like watching that whole thing go down this week, and I feel so sorry for that man's wife and his children. That's really all I can, if you know what I'm talking about with the Coldplay, that whole thing. Everyone's having their time on the internet, but my heart just goes out to the wife and the kids dealing with that fallout. I just so much pain. Anyway, you wreak havoc on your family when you do this kind of thing. So I started spending the time that I used to spend with my maternal grandmother, with my nanny. I started spending with my Aunt Louise and Uncle Richie and my cousins, who I was already spending every holiday with them and every summer with them and all of that. But then it started to be like the weekends that I was with my mom, she would often drive me to New Jersey and drop me off there, and I would spend the weekend, and I loved it. It was not a hardship in any way. I felt so happy to be there in this house with my aunt and my uncle and my 4 cousins and their dog. And, my aunt always said I was like her 5th child, and my Aunt Louise was very much cut from the same cloth as my grandmother. Just loving, affectionate, kind of person to just wrap you up in her arms, pull you up on her lap. She used to bounce me. She used to buy me a new pack of crayons every time, every weekend, and ooh and ah over my artwork. And I mean, make me whatever I wanted to eat, like whatever I felt like eating. That's what the family ate all weekend. And she had a cookie drawer for all the kids. She had a cookie drawer in her kitchen. You'd open the drawer, and there were like an assortment of cookies. But she also used to, if she would come into the city to pick me up, we would always stop at this bakery on the way back where I could get black and white cookies. If you don't know what those are, you're missing out. They're big. They're like the size of your face, and one side is, vanilla, one side's chocolate. And those were my favorite at the time. I haven't had one in a long time. Maybe I should do that this weekend. But she just was one of those people. I think my aunt and uncle, after my parents split, were very worried about my mom and about me. And this is 1975 when all this went down, when my grandmother died and my dad left. Women had only been able to have a bank account and a credit card in their own name for a year at that time. So my mother was kind of like on a mission to find a husband. I think she thought that was going to be the best way to keep us safe and keep a roof over our heads and just keep us secure. And so a lot of the time I was doing the 50-50 thing. I was going back and forth. And when I would come back to my mom's, she would be out a lot. I'd have a sitter. And it used to really be painful for me because I would miss her so much when I was at my dad's. I couldn't wait to get back. And then she'd like pick me up from after school care, and we'd be walking back to the apartment, and I would be carefully asking her, what the plan was, because I would know if we were going to maybe go to the American restaurant, which was a diner on 85th and Broadway, which is no longer there. That meant she was probably going to stay home. Or once in a while, she would want to go to Burger King. I hate to say it, but it's the truth. And I liked that because I could get the French fries and a chocolate shake. I didn't like the burgers. Smart kid even then. So I would know if we were going out to eat, then she was probably staying home for the night. And those were the best nights. But if she was getting us home quickly, then that probably meant a sitter was coming and she was going to go out. And I used to just suffer because I could not understand why she couldn't just do that half the week that I was at my dad's. And watching her, she would let me watch her get ready. I wasn't allowed to go into the bathroom. I never saw my mother naked until the very end of her life when she was in a hospital bed. And she needed help. That's the only time I ever saw my mother naked. She was very modest in that way. And I know I'm talking about my mother a lot, but it's all related. If you've been through loss and grief, then one grief kind of like opened as a portal to all the other losses. I don't know. It's just how it works. So, I'm going to shift to my Aunt Louise in a minute, but that's kind of how life was. I was in this just kind of precarious situation. And at my dad's house, it was worse because he was picking me up, and then we would go to some woman's house and he would put me in front of the TV and go into the other room to quote unquote rehearse. And then he would take me home to the woman who became my stepmother. And we would have dinner and she would say, "What did you do?" And he would say, "We went to the playground." And I would be quiet because he would tell me if she knew that we went to this woman's house or that woman's house or whatever, she would get jealous even though he hadn't done anything wrong. And these women were just friends, which obviously was not the case. So there was just a lot of confusion and pain and uncertainty. And I couldn't, my job at my dad's was kind of to take care of him and to keep his secrets and to make sure, my stepmom wasn't going to be upset. And to be like his tiny therapist. He would cry in my arms. He would say he needed to be free and he couldn't commit. And if only these women would share, everything would be fine, including my mother. If only my mother had been willing to share, everything would have been okay. And I thought he was the victim, so because I was little, I didn't know. My dad's crying, I don't know any better. I'm 4, 5, 6. And at my mom's, it was a lot of painful, kind of like never having her. I never felt like I had her. I didn't, because she wasn't like a hugger, and she wasn't a kisser, and she wasn't somebody to grab me and like kiss my cheek or tell me it was going to be okay or pull me onto her lap or even verbally give me very much praise. I basically heard from her if I did something wrong. That's when I got feedback. But if I did something right, that was just an expectation. And if I made her feel bad, she would get angry. So my tears were unwelcome. My sadness, if she was going out, like that was a recipe to upset her. So I was always trying not to upset her and to sort of like swallow my own sadness, my own grief, my own confusion over what was happening. I would press my face up to the window when she would leave, and that's when I would start to like bawl, BAWL, ball. And so that's kind of how life was. So when I would go to my Aunt Louise and Uncle Richie's, and you have this like very strong, husband and wife and 4 kids and the dog living in the house, it was amazing. I felt safe there, and I had grown up with them, and there was stability there, and there was love there, and there was laughter, and my cousins would fight over who I got to sleep with, my 2 girl cousins, whose bed I was going to sleep in. And it was just, I'm sorry if you're hearing any background noise. I have Rufus in the room with me again, my new rescue, and he's just happier if he's with me. So I've got like the door open and the dog in here. So I am sorry if you're hearing. Usually I'm very careful about the noise when I'm recording the podcast, but I'm a little more focused on Rufus right now. And I listened last week and it seemed okay. So hopefully it is okay. So I loved going. And that was a good weekend, and my Aunt Louise was, she just was the glue that held it all together. She was an incredible mom. She was so engaged with her kids. I loved my cousins. I looked up to them. They were like, you know how it is when kids are little and they're like preteens and teens in the house. They're, you're just like, it's that you're in awe a little bit. And to be loved like that and to be adored like that, they were all so excited every time I was there. It was kind of like a balm for me with all the things that were happening in my life. And my Aunt Louise in particular was just she was that maternal presence. My grandmother was gone, and my mother was, I think, really ill-equipped at the time. And honestly, she struggled for most of my life to mother me. She just couldn't, I'm that's a whole memoir in and of itself that I'm writing, currently. I'm almost done. So it's like, there's a whole thing there that I love my mother and I miss her every minute of the day. But it took a long time to get there. There's a lot of confusion and pain and her own alcoholism that got in the way of us being close and understanding one another. And yeah. But my Aunt Louise was just this steady force of enthusiastic love, unconditional love. And I would not be the person I am without her. And I was thinking about it, over the last few days, and there's just not even a blip. There's not a hiccup. She never raised her voice to me. And I'm not saying you can love someone unconditionally and raise your voice. I'm not saying that that's a requirement. I'm just saying in her case, I didn't ever give her a reason to raise her voice because I was so grateful to be in a safe place with this, with my family, that I was good. I didn't give her any reason to be upset with me, but she just never, there was nothing there ever except like pure, unadulterated, unconditional love. I didn't have to show up a certain way. It was okay if I was sad. It was okay if I was, all those things were okay. And I was writing about this one weekend that it sticks out in my mind because I was 7 and I was spending the weekend, and I came down the stairs one night to get a glass of water, and my aunt and uncle were in the bathroom together. And that was scandalous to me because my mother was, as I said, not the kind of person, like no one was allowed in the bathroom with her. And I didn't write this part, but the door was open and my Aunt Louise was peeing. She was sitting on the toilet, and the door was open enough that I could see that. And my Uncle Richie was standing there like brushing his teeth, and I was just like, what is happening, But they were just like, that's the kind of couple they were. They were like best friends. And, I mean, everybody's different. I know a lot of couples that do not go into the bathroom together, and then I know couples that do. But I just remember at 7 just being like absolutely stopped in my tracks. And then what I didn't expect is that they were talking about me. And my uncle was saying that I had become really serious and that it broke his heart, and that he was worried about my mother and me and, what was happening in our lives that was creating this seriousness. And that I used to be such a joyful kid. And I just remember, standing there and feeling, knowing that what he was saying was true. And I crept back up the stairs. I didn't get any water. And, my uncle was one of these men. He was very protective of my mother, of me, of his own children, obviously, of his wife. And I was writing about like once at the Jersey Shore, I was about 3, I got pulled into the ocean. The current took me, and like I couldn't, I remember that feeling of just being probably what it feels like to be in a wash cycle. Just like spinning, and suddenly he just plucked me up out of the ocean. He just was a force, and a good man, a good man and a good husband and a good father. And he, I think, really did not respect the fact that my dad left. I don't think he respected the fact that he left the week after my grandmother had died. I think he kept a lot of things he probably shared with my Aunt Louise, but, never said anything in front of me about my dad, or my mom, or the concerns. The only time that my uncle ever said anything to my mother in front of me that gave me an indication, that he was displeased is the Christmas that I was 6. My mom had a boyfriend named Frank who just really didn't like me. Like, he didn't like kids. It wasn't personal. He was not a guy who liked kids. It turned out he was not really a big fan of women. But anyway, she was dating him, and Christmas came, and my mother had basically, I wanted a tutu. And I'd been taking ballet for a couple of years, and there was this tutu that I wanted desperately. And I guess my mother had decided she was going to buy the tutu for Frank to give to me to try to like fix this relationship. So, Christmas morning comes, and there's a gift under the tree, and my mother says, hey, Frank brought you a gift. But I'm like, well, Santa brought me a gift, like, I don't know what you're really talking about. But anyway, okay. So I open it, and it's the tutu, and I'm like ecstatic. I could not believe I got this tutu that I wanted, and I went and put it on right away. And my mother comes into my bedroom, and she's like, you have to go thank Frank. He got this tutu for you. And I was like, no, Santa got it for me. What do you mean? And she's like, no, Frank got it for you. And I'm like, Mommy, like, Santa got it for me. Like, I wrote to Santa. I put it on my list. It's under the tree. Like, Santa got it for me. And that she was like, there is no Santa, and Frank got you this tutu, go out and thank him right now. She like grabbed my arm. It was like very face twisted, terrible way to find out, which I'm now going to have to put a warning on this podcast in case anybody listens around their children. I have to put like a giant, giant warning on the podcast because I don't want to be the reason anyone's kid finds out. But that's how I found out. And so we then went to my aunt and uncle's for dinner. No Frank, just us. He wasn't. It was early enough in the relationship. He was not invited. They didn't last very long. And so we get there, and my cousins, my aunt, my uncle, they're all excited, like, yeah, Santa, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, there is no Santa. And they're like, what are you talking about? Of course there is, and I'm like, no, there's no Santa. It's not real, like it's all whatever. And I just was like devastated. And my uncle's like, what are you talking? And I explained, well, Frank, this, that, the tutu. And my uncle looked at my mother, his sister, and said, Kath, she's 6. And I remember, and my mother like turned red but didn't say anything. And that's the only time in my life that I can remember feeling like my mother knew she was wrong and didn't defend herself. I think it mattered to her what her brother thought. And he was 11 years older. And I think he had become sort of like the man in the house when her dad died. And I think she was kind of, devastated that she had let him down in that way. Other than that, there was nothing. There was no indication except for the conversation I overheard, But they were amazing to me. And I think that my Aunt Louise worked hard to make my time with them as joyful as it could possibly be. And as my cousins got older, of course things changed. They became like older teenagers and they wanted to be out with their friends. And so when I would come over, then, she would be there with me and like, doing artwork with me and reading books with me and just making the time great. She used to, at the end of every day, she used to hand wash the linoleum floor in the kitchen, and with like a soapy bucket of water. They had this poodle Mitzi, and you know how it is when you're little, and then you go back later, everything is smaller than you thought it was. The kitchen seemed enormous to me. The poodle seemed enormous to me. And they weren't. The kitchen is like a little eat-in dining table that seemed huge to me. 7 of us fit around it, but we must have been really like packed in there. And the floor is not as big as I thought. There was an island. But yeah, it's just funny when when you see things and you're older, you realize like, oh, this isn't as big as I thought. Not that there was never a lot of time that went by, where I wasn't seeing the house. It's just that you, at a certain point, when I moved to Los Angeles, and then like at some point I went back and I was like, oh, this is so much smaller than I thought it was as a kid. They had a rec room down in the basement, and my uncle had a pool table, and there were all these games in the game closet, and the laundry was down there, and he had a big, like TV down there and an overstuffed couch. And I just have all these core childhood memories in that house, being surrounded by my cousins, my aunt, my uncle. My uncle, I was writing about this too. I mean, my mother had a lot of traumatic loss in her life, and I know that did not, obviously that never helps anyone. When I was 17, obviously like all of my cousins had moved out of the house by then, and my aunt had started working for a gourmet food company. She's really smart, my aunt, and she had moved up the company. And like, I remember going to the Javits Center once in New York City, and she was part of this giant like food conference organizing everything. I was so proud of her. so they had decided to take their first kid-free vacation, like since before their kids were born. So my aunt had come out to California for a food conference, and my uncle was going to meet her here the day after the conference ended, and then they were going to start their vacation. And the day before he was supposed to get on the plane, he went to a friend's house and walked in and like wasn't feeling well, and the wife, he was a husband and wife, friends of theirs, said he looked pale and was like kind of sweaty, and she went to get him some water. He had a heart attack and he did not make it. And my aunt was 53 at the time, which is a year younger than I am now, and it was just a total shock. I mean, my uncle was just this big, muscular guy. Like, he smoked and he drank. So it's not like a total shock. But at the time, I didn't realize because I was a kid. So he's always smelled like Old Spice, never smoked in the house. And so my cousin called the house, and I just remember hearing this sound come out of my mother from the other side of the house. Like I knew instantly she started yelling, and then she yelled for me to pick up the phone, but she was making noises that were not like, they weren't even words. She was yelling. And I picked up the line, and it was my cousin. Cousin was crying, explained like what had happened. And my oldest cousin, Richie, went to come out to California and get my Aunt Louise because everyone felt like she needed to be told in person. So he came out to California to get her, tell her, and bring her home. So that was like absolutely devastating. My Aunt Louise, she never dated again. She tried. Years later, all of us were saying to her, like, why don't you try to just like find a little companionship, like whatever. She went out a couple of times. She was just like, no, I can't do it. It's not for me. Put her wedding ring right back on, and that was it. And she had a lot of girlfriends. She traveled. She got into yoga. And I used to talk all the time. Once I moved to California, we would talk on the phone. Usually, like every 2 or 3 weeks, we would have a long conversation. We would talk for like an hour. She wanted to know everything about what was going on in my life, how things were going for me, what was happening. And I would want to know what was happening for her too. And as I got older, she started to share more adult things the way that you do. Hopefully your conversations evolve. And so I started to know things that were happening in her life and things that were not always so easy. And I've written about this too, and I talked about it last week, and I won't talk about it for too long because I won't be able to keep going. But when I was 26, my cousin Richie lost his little boy, who was also named Richard after my uncle, when he was 6 years old. And that was obviously my Aunt Louise's grandson. And that was really painful. So my poor Aunt Louise, she went through a lot of sudden loss and painful loss. And she just was such a good, loving person that, it's painful to think about. But I think most of us go through, we go through some loss. Some people go through more than others. It's not a level playing field. And she suffered, it really broke her heart. And it broke all of our hearts. But, she's just a really deeply feeling person. And it really broke her heart. And she was just so devoted to her children and her grandchildren and eventually her great-grandchildren. My cousin Carol moved to England, and she has 4 daughters. 2 of her daughters I haven't even mentioned, my Aunt Louise is an identical twin. And when I was little, it was my Aunt Renee, it was her sister. And she used to come over a lot, and they were incredibly close. Some twins are like, they want space, they want distance. This was not them. And Aunt Renee would show up sometimes in the exact same outfit and they hadn't talked about it. And when I was really little, I couldn't tell them apart. And I'd get really anxious because in my brain, I thought I should be able to I should know who my Aunt Louise was no matter what. As I got older, I could tell them apart, but it's just so interesting to me when I think about it because, it's like 4, 5, 6, 7, and they were identical, they were identical twins. Now, when I got older, yeah, I could easily tell them apart, but it's like just so sad that I was putting that kind of pressure on myself as a kid. I don't think I ever even told her that I was worried about that. But anyway, so my cousin Carol has twin girls and they come on yoga retreats with me. Like this side of the family is very close. I love my Hamiltons. And so that's who I'm talking about here. Anyway, so we've been close forever, and every time I go back to New York, I always go and see my Aunt Louise. I saw her in May, and I'm really grateful that I did. Usually we're able to all have a big dinner together, like my cousins, my cousin Diane and her boys will come. But we couldn't make that happen. My cousin Richie and his wife Mary, like we usually are able to get everybody together. And this last time in May, it was sudden. I didn't have a big heads up on that last trip. And so I ended up renting a car to go see my Aunt Louise. I just went and had lunch with her. And I'm so glad that I did. And when I was leaving, she'd had a bunch of mini strokes over the last few years. And, I had noticed like it had slowed her down a little bit, but that's about it. My cousin Diane lives very close and was on it. It was like she had a 24-hour caregiver in the house. Like she was with my cousin Diane. My cousin Diane now has a house down at the Jersey Shore, so my Aunt Louise was down there every weekend. And for a long time, my Aunt Louise worked with my cousin Joey at his business. So he's very tight knit. She's very close with her children. Anyway, she FaceTimed with my cousin Carol in England and all of Carol's girls and great grandkids on Sunday, and she had a massive stroke on Sunday night. So, it's just one of those really big losses in your life of a person who just loved you unconditionally. And I hope that you have one of those, at least, people in your life, who just really loved you unconditionally. With my mom, it was so complicated and there was so much pain mixed in with all of it. And we got there in the end. We got there for the last few weeks of her life, thankfully. I was writing about my Aunt Louise the day that my mom was rushed to the hospital. I flew in and, instantly, and I got there and my mom was on a ventilator. And she wasn't conscious at first, my mom, and then she became conscious about an hour after I arrived, and I like went racing over, to her bed and was, mom. But there were wires going everywhere, and I was holding her hand, and I was talking to her, and she was squeezing my hand, so I knew she could hear me, and she knew I was there, and I was explaining to her what was going on and all of that. But I was really scared, of course, and I had let my Aunt Louise know what was happening and my cousins. And so my Aunt Louise came a couple hours later with my cousin. My Aunt Louise wasn't driving anymore at that point. My cousin Diane brought her in. My cousin Kim was there, it's Joey's wife. And and they came, and my Aunt Louise grabbed me and hugged me. She like looked me in the eye. She did not tell me it was going to be okay, because it wasn't. And then she went over to my mother, and she just did it so gracefully, but she just reached her hands in between like all those wires, and held my mother's face and just looked at her. And the way my mother looked at her was just like with such pure love and trust. And I kind of saw my mom as like a little girl for a minute. And those people that are able to love you like that, no matter what, they're such a treasure. They're such a gift. And it's such a loss. I can tell you, because I've been through so much. I've lost a lot of people in the last few years. It's kind of like this week I was just like, oh, I didn't even tell my friends. I didn't text anyone because I don't want to keep burdening people with my grief. Maybe you relate. When you lose a lot of people in a short amount of time, I think it's hard for people to stay with it because some people, not people who've lost people, but a lot of people just can't. It's just hard for them. They just can't deal with it. So I really didn't even text anybody because I know I'm going to be okay. And I'm already okay. I'm just really sad. And this is what grief looks like, It hurts. But I know that it's part of the deal. And if anything, it should like make us all really be living and loving our hearts out as much as possible and making sure the people we love really know how much we love them and just not waiting. I think about my aunt and my uncle and that vacation they never got to take. And, just like, I know it's so hard. We've created such a ridiculous set of circumstances in this world where it's just hard just to survive. It is. It's hard to keep a roof over your head. It's hard to take care of your family. So sometimes a vacation is not in the cards, but at least like to make sure you're telling people how you feel. And that's my goal every day. It's just to make sure that the people I love are not confused about how much I love them. And if I feel like I've done that, then I've had a successful day. That's kind of how I have been doing my life for a long time now. But yeah, I didn't really tell anyone. I obviously wrote about it this week, and a couple of people that I am close to texted me after, like, are you okay? It's like, why didn't you text me? And what can I do? And honestly, like, the best thing that anyone could do is just really, spend quality time with the people you love. That's the best thing you can do for me. Spend quality time with the people you love and try to spread some kindness and some love in this world. And I was writing about, like, if you doubt whether one person can have that big of an impact, I mean, look at this. It's like I spent a lot of time, I think, because my own mother had such a hard time mothering me. She just wasn't, I don't think she had the tools. She wasn't naturally equipped, or, maybe it was the trauma. I think a lot of it was. I think there's a lot of things. I mean, I know there are a lot of things. I've been writing about it for a few years now. But it creates, when your own mother struggles to express her love, to you in a way that feels good. As I think also as a daughter, there's that mother daughter thing that can be very difficult when your own mother's really, you know, not able to do that. It makes you feel like you must be unlovable at your core, like you must be broken. There must be something in you that is not right if your own mother can't do it. And my grandmother and then my aunt, I think, loved me in such a way that even though I struggled with that doubt for a long time, anytime I was with my grandmother, I was too little to even be thinking those things, but later, and my aunt, it was just like, it felt preposterous, like I would talk to her or spend time with her. And I never even said that out loud. I never even said to her, like, sometimes I think I'm broken or whatever, like, because it would have been crazy to say it in her presence. Like, that's how much she loved me, that in her presence, I couldn't even get those words out of my mouth because they seemed insane even to me. That's how much she loved me, that like I couldn't possibly doubt whether I was lovable or not when I was with her because it was just like almost funny. And those people, that's such a huge thing to give to someone without even just because of the way you're loving them. Whether I told her eventually, my Aunt Louise, as I got older and we were having more adult conversations, of course I talked to her about my mother's alcoholism and all the things that were happening when my mother got ALS, and she was blaming me and, was talking to my Aunt Louise about it, and she was amazing. She was a rock. And she was able to be that for me without, turning on my mother, which I wouldn't have wanted her to do. I didn't, that's not what I was looking for. I didn't want that. I just needed some help. She was able to do that, which is also rare, to be able to do both, to love my mother with all of her flaws completely and to love me and be like, that's also not okay what's happening, like, or that's not true, or, like anyway. So if you ever doubt whether you can have that kind of impact just by showing up with a lot of love, like that's one of the things I really wanted to get across this week. Like, in the world as it is right now, and you all know how I feel. Obviously, I didn't really write about that this week, and that's okay. We don't have to write about it every week, talk about it every week, but it's there. I think it's so important to remind yourself that you can be a safety net for people, and you can have such a meaningful impact on the people around you and the world around you just by showing up in a loving way. And I know it might not feel like that right now. You might be feeling a lot of despair, or a lot of depression, or a lot of fear, or a lot of anxiety. And I understand, I'm feeling all those things too. But I know in my heart that there are just so many people in the world like my Aunt Louise, who are they just want the world to be beautiful, and they want everyone to be okay. And I have this belief that I've written about, I think, a number of times, just that there isn't there's no such thing as other people's children, It's like children belong to the world, and they belong to all of us. It's like they come through us. They belong to themselves. They belong to the world. And you can have a huge impact on a child's life, on their own self-esteem, on the way that they feel, I have so many teachers who've helped me, when I was a kid and a young teenager, teachers who believed in me and made me believe in myself. And, I've done a lot of volunteering in my kids' school and like really tried to pay that forward. And there are a lot of ways to pay that kind of thing forward. And I hope we're all trying to figure out what those are in our own families and our own communities. But yeah, I mean, I think in honor of, all the people that we lose who are like the Andrea Gibsons of the world, and the Aunt Louises of the world who are maybe less known and less celebrated, but just as loving, like just to try to show up with that energy and trust that it's more than enough. And, and when we lose people that we treasure like this, it hurts. It hurts, it hurts to not hear someone's voice or be able to get on a plane and hug them. Like it hurts, but it's part of life. And I don't think that they're gone. I feel my mother around me all the time. Sometimes I feel her like in me. I can feel her like energy moving through me sometimes, which is really interesting. And I hope that, I feel my Aunt Louise in that same way. I hope I can feel her moving through me. I think I do already. Feel my grandmother, I think people continue to live through us, through the memories that we have, but also through the energy and the love that they gave us. I think that lives on. And I think that you honor people like that by being as loving as you can be while you're here. So thank you for getting through all of my like tears there. And I think it's the second week in a row. And I'm going to be with my family this weekend for the funeral, and I know that will be comforting to be together and cry together. And, I'm going to stay at my Aunt Louise's house, and that'll be good. And just, just the memories and just honoring people is always good. And yeah, if you're grieving or you've been grieving or you've lost a lot of people, it's been like a nonstop for me. My mom at the end of 21, and then my half sister died 6 months later, and my dad in 23. And I mean, it's just, our dog died at the end of October, and maybe it sounds weird to put him in the mix, but it isn't if you've had a dog that you love with your whole heart. And my Aunt Louise, it's a lot. But I also have a new rescue, and he's bringing a lot of joy. So it's like, you just kind of have to let your heart break open, and that way you can like let the grief flow and let the joy flow, and, keep breathing and try to keep your heart open and keep your hands open and keep your mind open and see what you can do to add more love to the mix. So I love you. I'm sending you love, and you know where to find me if you need some help or some support. I am doing a month-long course that's starting July 26th, which is Saturday, July 26th, and you can reach out to me if you want to know more about that.